Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first live office hour for the MOOC on Environmental Security and Sustaining Peace. I'm Carl Bruch, Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute and one of the core faculty for the course. I've done a lot of work on protecting the environment during armed conflict and in post-conflict peace building, and have a lot of different research threads that relate to this. So we're very excited to be here with you. I'm here today with David Jensen. David is the head of Environmental Cooperation for Peace Building Program for UN Environment. David, before we get started, maybe you could say a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Sure, thanks, Carl, and it's great to be here, everyone. So I'm inside UN Environment in the Crisis Management Branch, and as Carl mentioned, I've been leading up a program called Environmental Cooperation for Peace Building, which basically looks at the links between natural resource, conflict, and peace, and these are all the kinds of issues that you're dealing with right now in the MOOC. I'm also co-directing the MapX platform for mapping and monitoring natural resources and environmental change, which hopefully you will experience as well inside the MOOC. So it's great to be here. These are issues that I've been working on for most of my professional career. I am really honored that there are 6,000 people now joining us. I think we just crossed 6,050 from 177 countries, and I feel very humbled that there are so many people interested in taking the course and sharing their knowledge, and I really look forward to learning as much as possible from this massive diversity of voices and countries involved.
So we had a number of people who submitted questions in advance on the platform, and I think we'll start with those, but we would also encourage people who are watching to submit questions in the YouTube comments section, and we can have those addressed as we go along. I think the first question that somebody asked was, doesn't economic valuation of the environment have the potential to lead to more conflicts, since resources are then highlighted with a potential price tag, which could lead some criminal groups to capture or take hostage such resources to fund their activities? It seems to me, the person asking the question, that environmental conflicts often occur because a specific natural resource has an associated economic value. On the other hand, we often hear that in order to protect the environment and reduce pollution, we need to put a price on the environment in order to reduce externalities. David, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think most natural resources that have an economic value, that economic value is well known already. I think what the question is, or what the discipline is putting a price tag on those natural resources which are common property resources, or which don't have a very clear economic value: ecological services, water services, air quality. So I don't think that putting an economic price tag on those is necessarily going to be used in nefarious ways by armed groups, because they're very hard to capture. I actually think this is fundamental in terms of understanding the value of these resources compared to other forms of land use, for example. And I believe you fundamentally, to manage anything, it begins by measuring it. And so I think we have to measure where these resources are, what their values are, and what's the benefit to society in terms of using them versus other forms of land use. So I think it's a good step forward, and a fundamental one.
I think there's also this asymmetry of information that people have, or different groups have, that often certain people have certain people or entities have a good understanding of how widespread certain minerals are, or what the potential value is, and others may not have the same information. And so part of the reason for doing this is to ensure that, for instance, when the government gives a concession, that they are able to demand fair value for that concession, and that a portion of that is then going back to the community. So it is this whole knock-on series of effects. I think that I understand the argument. I don't think I've seen where this has actually led to more conflicts. It's usually the valuation and the dissemination of that information is used to get everyone onto a common platform, to establish a common understanding, and then a vision for how to proceed with managing that resource.
Yeah, absolutely, Carl. I just want to add that when we were initially developing the MapX platform, one of the overriding goals was to equalize information environmental information and natural resource information amongst all stakeholders, and offer that common platform that everybody could access to obtain trusted information that they could use in decision making. And the ultimate goal there was, as you say, better benefit sharing amongst the different groups, more fair benefit sharing, better mitigation of identification, mitigation of risks, et cetera, et cetera. So I fundamentally believe that it is an essential precondition to better resource management.
Somebody else had a question about human rights. How can states and multinationals be called upon to enforce human rights approaches in their business endeavors? And you want to take?
Well, I think, again, most of this begins with transparency and actually some kind of transparent way to monitor what's going on and to make that information public, and to basically use that kind of transparency to incentivize a better human rights record. So I'm definitely in favor of monitoring and publication of that kind of data to show where the problems are and to put some kind of public pressure on better adherence to human rights.
I think that in addition to the transparency, there's kind of a related aspect, which is the reputational risk. This may apply more to multinationals than to states, but we see in a number of cases there are plenty of multinationals that could do better on their human rights considerations, but we see a lot of cases the multinational are held to account to this in their home jurisdictions, and so they have one standard that applies across the board, but this isn't necessarily what the companies within that country are following, and so there's a unlevel playing field. And sometimes multinationals can also be a champion of using human rights approaches because they have to follow them for their own business risk, and they help to put pressure on all actors to adhere to those rights. So I think part of it is the transparency, part of it is the level playing field. I think there's also codes of conduct that are sometimes required in order to access certain funding. And so those are other ways that I think we see used. In some cases, there's litigation, but that tends to be very rare in this realm in terms of the number of companies operating vis-a-vis the number of cases that are actually brought. So I think litigation, while it's tempting for those who are lawyers, is not in practice. It's not the most common by a long stretch.
Yeah, and I would also say that the companies I've talked to in some of these sectors where there have been problems, and particularly in the mining sector, they really understand that maintaining the social license to operate fundamentally hinges on respecting human rights. And you see let's say initiatives like the voluntary principles on security and human rights emerging, which provide that kind of normative guidance and baseline in terms of how to respect and protect human rights in different operating environments. So I see, at least in who I speak with, much more recognition of the fundamental need to protect and respect human rights as part of their basic operating conditions and part of their social license to operate.
There was a question that just came through. I want to bounce to it because it touches on something that I like. Can we see the history of humanity through the war for natural resources? And since when can we say that it started? Because it goes to the fact that this is not a new phenomenon. This goes back to you look at the Bible and Cain and Abel, fighting over land. You look at some of the there's a famous story about the first sacred war that used plants to poison water sources to disable the defenders. You look at Babylon and diverting water resources. This goes back for a very, very long time. And so I don't know that when we could say it first started, but a lot of the earliest literature that we have ties to this. And so I think that it's important to acknowledge that. One of the things that I think is so interesting is that as people saw problems, you saw efforts to try to prevent it and address it. And in Deuteronomy, there's a passage that reads, "The trees of the field are not your enemy, that you should besiege them." And this is, the idea being that, the trees of the field, which generally are interpreted to be more orchards and such, but these are productive, they are resources, and you're not supposed to just destroy them. And so I think that this goes way back, both the problems and the solutions. I don't know, David, if you have other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a red thread across most civil wars, definitely. I would say the best book I've ever read on this particular topic, looking at a historical perspective, is one called The Prize by Daniel Yergin. It looks at the history of conflict over oil and both direct conflict, but also how oil was so essential to fighting different wars. And I think it's a really interesting take on exactly that, how natural resource, in particular petroleum resources, were a fundamental part of the overall war effort and war motivation.
There's another book that I like, Wine and War, that looks at the role of wine and war throughout history. It tends to be more in the last century, but it does go back a ways.
I think that sounds like a good book to read. I think I'll have to order that one.
Going to one of the questions people had asked beforehand, what are the best practices to raise awareness among local and international organizations acting in emergency and humanitarian crisis about possible environmental impacts generated by their operations? How to convince them to not only improve their practices and solutions, but also to use the environment as a mechanism, as a tool to construct opportunities?
I have that's a brilliant question and extremely well worded. I would say there's two levels. One, they have to have a policy directive in place that guides all of their operations. So they need to be thinking about it before they even deploy, and it needs to be a part of their policy DNA. Because it's typically too late to begin addressing once they're already operating in that context. So they need to be thinking about it before. It needs to be a part of their policy framework, and it needs to be basically something they are planning to do before deployment. So certainly there's a policy part of it, but also there's a data part of it. And this is something we're working on. We're trying to collect as much high quality environmental data inside MapX, and then we're trying to stream that right into the mobile applications of different humanitarian actors. So when they're planning a camp in a particular situation, like in Zambia, for example, they have access to the best available spatial information on different natural resources and environmental risks, and they can take that into account immediately in the planning of that camp boundary, and in looking at the potential risks and coming up with immediate risk mitigation strategies. And the app we're building or helping them build actually has algorithms to automatically recommend different risk mitigation strategies relative to the answers they provide in the application. So it's also about getting access to data and getting the data at the right place, right time, right format, right scale to the actors that need it when they're taking those early decisions in terms of client planning. And the cool thing is that we actually have a successful case in the Zambia situation where we did provide different environmental data sets. We identified different risks, and the boundaries of that camp changed on the basis of the data we provided. So there's a direct correlation in terms of providing data and identifying risks, and then having the planning framework change accordingly, and obviously take those risks into account. So we were very happy to show that it can work, and now we're trying to find partners that could help us scale this to all humanitarian operations and all humanitarian actors.
David, one of the things that strikes me also is that, especially for emergency and humanitarian operators, they're chronically underfunded, and there are so many immediate needs. There's a question of how does one convince them to do this? Not just how to do it, but when you only have 23 cents of the dollar you need, why should we be focusing on these longer term considerations and not just putting our energy into providing shelter and food, for example?
Yeah, there's two things I want to say. The first thing, which is a third part of my last answer, which I think is important to highlight, is the sphere standards that have been developed that now also include different environmental standards on waste and water and a number of different natural resources. So I think that's in terms of basic humanitarian standards, the sphere now actually include environmental provisions, and so there's certainly an incentive to begin following those. I think, but more importantly, I mean, ultimately, we're not talking about protecting the environment for the sake of the environment. These humanitarian operations are happening in places where people live, where people need the water, where they need the forest, they need the natural resources. And so by having an impact on these natural resources, you're affecting host communities and you're affecting livelihoods. And so the humanitarian of the reputation of humanitarian actors themselves is put in jeopardy if they damage the environment, if they damage natural resources for those host communities. I also think that in the longer term, I mean, if you're extracting groundwater, for example, for a camp without actually understanding how much groundwater is available to extract, ultimately you're setting yourself up for massive vulnerability in your own operation. So you need to understand which natural resources you're depending on to meet basic humanitarian needs, and what's the sustainable rate of extraction for those. And if you fail to understand that, you're potentially setting yourself up to not provide those services in the longer term, or the lifetime of the camp. So I think I'm sort of beyond this argument of justifying why, frankly, the standards are in place. Agencies cannot, unintentionally damage resources in the communities where they're operating, and ultimately they need to be aware just for their own operations in terms of sustainability of some of these services they're offering. So I think I think it's actually shifted now from convincing them that this is the right thing to do to basically then how do we operationalize this and how do we take this forward? Carl, what's your sense?
I think there are a lot within the humanitarian world that see the world differently than they did 10 years ago, in part because of climate change, in part because there's more awareness of these substantial humanitarian investments in long-term disaster response, like Sudan. The examples you were giving of is generally humanitarian assistance is viewed as an emergency room. It's just keeping people alive for the moment, and then you'll do triage, they'll go back home, and we'll go back to development. But most of the money that is being spent these days on humanitarian operations is going to long-term, 8, 10, 20 years, people displaced from their homes, whether you're in Afghanistan or associated with Sudan or other places. These are not the historic short-term emergencies, or at least what was viewed as short-term. So I think that there's a different way of seeing it. I still get this question of how do I justify this? And so even when there's somebody who's sympathetic, I think they're still dealing with others who are trying to stretch the dollars and make the dollars work. I think your answers and how to frame that are good for that, but I think that I still hear some of these questions.
Yeah, I think we have to get into the use case. I think the problem that we in the environmental community have faced is that we're not being specific when we use this term environment, and still humanitarians think we're talking about, I don't know, ecological services and just broader issues. But the moment you say, okay, let's talk about protecting groundwater quality, and then they're like, oh yeah, that's absolutely essential. And if you say, well, let's talk about protecting forest resources, which people are using for energy, oh yeah, that's important. And so it really, if you break it down and you actually be specific about what you're trying to do, most see the value and actually understand it. And in many cases, it's actually part of their operational framework. It's just that we keep lumping all of these individual sectors into this one term environment, and we're not being specific enough about it. And I think that does cause probably more confusion than it helps solve.
There's a question here about youth. I'm working with politically divided youth, trying to unite them on the basis of a greener, cleaner environment. but some are not very receptive to the idea and have taken things to the next level. What contributing factors other than natural resources should be complemented, like capacity building? What are some success stories?
That's a great question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple of examples, more on the success stories, and I would encourage the person to look at a couple of examples. One is the work of EcoPeace Middle East, which has brought together Israelis, Jordanians, and Palestinians, sometimes at the political local level, so mayors, and sometimes quite a bit of work with youth from different sides. And some of it is having them get out, see the Jordan Valley, the waters that they share, and building a common connection to it. Some of it is having them clean up or do activities together where they both have an interest in it. But I would encourage you to look at EcoPeace Middle East. There's another little different approach by Outward Bound, which is taking often city kids out into rural areas and really trying to get them to see the value of nature. And they've started to do this through a peace building lens. And so you might take a look at how they're doing that and what the lessons are. I have the sense that there are other organizations that are also working on this, but those are the two that I'm most familiar with.
Yeah, this would be a great question to ask one of our colleagues in Nairobi, Richard Muang, about engagement in youth on some of these environmental issues. I would have said two things. One, youth needs to have a voice in different decision-making processes around natural resources. I think in many cases they're marginalized and they're not given a place or a space to participate in some of these big decisions. So I think there needs to be that youth perspective informing this. I think the second thing I would say, that probably the approach I would take, and this is probably a bit of an easy answer, is I find, including myself, that a lot of younger people love technology and love to explore technology, and they feel very much empowered by it. And so how can you use technology to bring youth together? Just in terms like basic data collection around a natural resource. How can we have applications on mobile phones that thousands of youth are all contributing into a common data set, which they can then use to to look at management solutions or benefit sharing, things like that. So how can we use technology to engage youth, to jointly collect data, and to then help formulate some kind of position going forward? I think that's certainly how I would try to structure my engagement.
There's a question about definitions. What does the word post-conflict mean? How do you know when you're in that phase? We spent a lot of time when we started our work on post-conflict peace building and natural resource management. And to be honest, maybe I can explain what we did and then the limitations of that and what we did as a result. So we were focusing initially on the window of opportunity that comes up when you have the end of a conflict, of an armed conflict. There may be a peace agreement, there may be victory, but it's usually a peace agreement these days. So when you have when the armed conflict stops, it doesn't mean that the social conflict stops. It doesn't mean that people suddenly agree with one another, but there is a ostensible end to armed conflict. And then the question is, can you make the peace last? Can you make the peace stick? And we were looking at the role of natural resources in reintegrating ex-combatants, in providing basic services and peace dividends, in rebuilding the economy. And we saw all sorts of problems when we got into the specific examples. So it may be that a country, you have the end of the peace agreement, but there be flare-ups of violence. Does this mean that we're back into conflict, or that we are in the pre-conflict stage, or is it just a blip? And the only way of telling that is passage of time. And then the question, when does that post-conflict period end? When are you in sustainable development? And again, that's our response to that. Again, it has its limitations. Is when the narrative is not so much about conflict, when it's more about the usual development questions that come up. So you can see usually when the post-conflict period starts, in that the end point is often 5, 10, 20 years out, depending on the context. There is a limitation, which I think is really good to highlight, and that's you don't necessarily know when you're in that phase, or if you're in the pre-conflict phase, or how to when, say, Colombia, which was many parts of Colombia were not in hot conflict, but there are still regions that were. How do you describe the country? You can describe the region, but describing the country is difficult. And so we've taken much more of a, since then, we've, I think, focused more on broadly the linkages between environment, conflict, and peace, and recognizing that this is a very messy situation. It is geographically specific, and you don't always know where you are until you have the benefit of hindsight. I don't know, David, are there things that you would add or clarify on that?
I would add 2 points. The first, from our side, from the UN side, is that we also were triggered by the peacekeeping mission. So when a peacekeeping mission was deployed, that would certainly be for us to start getting involved in, quote unquote, this post-conflict phase. But frankly, it's a terrible term. As Carl said, it's a term that we've moved away from. We used to be called the Post-Conflict and Disaster Management Branch, and eventually we got rid of it because it made no sense, and now we're just the Crisis Management Branch. I think what's important is that the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, they in 2016, they adopted a new conceptual framework called Sustaining Peace. And they're trying with that new framework to look at peace building in a much more temporal way, in terms of preventing the outbreak, escalation, continuation, and recurrence of conflict, and increasing the emphasis on addressing root causes and conflict prevention. So I think even at the Security Council level, they saw the limitations of post-conflict, and they're trying to reimagine what peace building is, and to understand that peace building happens in a much more temporal way across the whole conflict spectrum. And so that's exactly why that sustaining peace is part of the idea of our course. As Carl mentioned, environmental security and sustaining peace is really about looking at the role of natural resource in the environment across that conflict cycle.
We have a couple of questions that relate to biodiversity and conservation, and I'll just put them both on the table. There are actually 3 questions related. One is, can conservation of natural resources and preservation of endangered species prevent the war for resources? Somewhat related, can you say something about the interface between biodiversity and conflict, and the role of conflict-sensitive conservation and transboundary ecological collaboration as tools for peace building? How degradation of biodiversity caused by conflict can hinder the peace-building process, and pathways to mitigate this. So this is prevention of conflict, what happens during conflict, and mitigating the effects of conflict on biodiversity.
Now, Carl, I'm looking for the first question in the Hangout list. I'm not seeing it. Can you just repeat the first one so I can answer that to start with?
Can conservation of natural resources and preservation of endangered species prevent the war for resources?
I think it's completely context specific, but also it really depends on what that war over resources is about, and whether it's directly over those resources, or if those resources are just financing it. It really depends on the political context, the social context, and understanding what are those core drivers. And certainly, I think in some situations, conservation or improved resource management can certainly reduce tensions and reduce competition, support livelihoods, be a source of collaboration. Yes, but if the war is over higher level political ideals or political conflict, then probably no. So it really depends on the context and the conflict, the contours of that particular conflict and the drivers.
And I think that some of it depends on the nature of, as you say, it's the context and the political economy that we saw with the Cordillera del Condor peace park between Ecuador and Peru, where the conservation was a conservation around that shared area was part of the resolution of the dispute. And I think that that resolution is going to be tested as we see discovery of oil and gas in the region. And so the political economy changes, and the implications for where you draw the borderline suddenly get much more valuable, much more economically significant. But we do see that it has, I think that one of the things that I think is important to look at here is not just at the total result of is there peace or conflict. It's also the different elements. So often collaboration around biodiversity, around their habitats, protected areas, biodiverse, rich areas. We see that that is very important for livelihoods. We see it's important for the local economies. We see that it's important for local politics. And so that it doesn't necessarily decide whether there will be peace or conflict, but it can be a substantial element of that discourse. And so it can influence the process. I wanted to come to this question of how degradation of biodiversity can be mitigated. And one idea that IUCN and others have advanced is the idea of designating certain areas off limits before conflict. So as you see things that are, as you see the disputes escalating to violence, there is, at times, there have been negotiations between the parties to say, well, if things go poorly and we see war, certain areas are no-go zones for the combatants. And this often happens more with cultural sites of significance. But there's been a proposal that IUCN put on the table almost 20 years, more than 20 years ago now, that has been taken up by the Special Rapporteur of the International Law Commission addressing protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict. And that's the designation of certain protected areas as off limits to combatants. And this means that combatants will not go into the area, which would make it a target. And people might say, well, isn't that rather naive? Isn't that overly optimistic? And one of the things I think is striking is that when there is, people often are fighting with one another. They're not fighting with nature. When they have shared values, sometimes they go to extraordinary lengths to protect the environment, even as they're doing unspeakable things to one another. And we saw this with the mountain gorillas during the Rwandan genocide. And I think that you do see examples where the environment is respected by all sides. And that so I think that there are ways that we can foster cooperation around biodiversity and prevent or mitigate damage to biodiversity during conflict.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think, Carl, you probably have the statistics that that are probably going to escape me now, but in terms of the relationship between biodiversity hotspots and armed conflict over a period of time, I believe the number is 80%.
More than that. So I think it's more like 91% of conflicts. This was a paper published in early 2000s. the vast majority of conflicts took place in biodiversity hotspots.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then, we've seen, I've been in Colombia, and there's a case study in the MOOC on Colombia, and we've gone into one of the most biodiverse rich places in all the world, in the Choco region, and the Rio Quito River. And, it's an amazing place, but there's, because it's so, in a sense, open and wild in a sense, it's also where there's a huge amount of illegal or informal gold mining, and creating a huge environmental footprint, both in terms of the physical scar, but also in terms of the mercury that's being used in the extraction of that gold. So definitely, you do see that a lot. And, where you have biodiversity and protected areas, where you have people that are trying to survive and cope during a conflict, they also become the areas that actually have natural resources left. And so they become targets for extraction and for settlements, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely, I think the ILC, it is important to at least make this a norm, that these areas should be off limits, that they should be protected, and that communication on this should happen at the outset. So there are particular areas that stay out of the conflict.
There are a couple of questions related to environmental impact assessment and along those lines. And I think that this raises some important questions about the linkage between environmental peace building and environmental governance more broadly. And maybe first take some of those questions quickly and then talk about the broader linkages. That works, David?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
So is the environmental impact assessment considered part of human rights? And I think this is a very interesting question. I in part because if you look at it directly, look at human rights instruments, very few, I don't know of any that actually talk about environmental impact assessment. That said, it's well established that environmental impact assessment is an obligation, both under domestic law and under what the International Court of Justice calls the general principles of international law. So there are different legal foundations for this, and that are outside the human rights side. I think on the human rights side, there are often procedural protections that people's rights to resources, people's right to a healthy environment, these sorts of rights are both protected substantively, and they are protected by way of procedures that governments cannot arbitrarily impact those rights. So I think that one can make a good argument that environmental impact assessment could be that there are human rights dimensions of that. It's not actually enshrined, but I think that this is a space that is probably coming that's coming to the fore.
Carl, what about the human right to access to information? I mean, wouldn't that fall into one of the whole purposes of conducting an EIA?
Well, it depends on how you define the right to information. Often that is the right to information that exists. And in EIA, often the question is not whether to make it public. That is often a question, actually. But does the government have an obligation to perform an EIA, to generate new information? And I think that's where it's that the right to information is more once that's been produced, that they have a right to see it.
And I think the question I can see in this screen is, does the government have a right to waive the requirement for an environmental impact assessment for a particular extraction of a particular resource? I guess that would depend on the legal framework of that particular country. And if it's enshrined in a legal framework that there are provisions which allow waiving a particular requirement, then yes. And if it's not reflected, then probably no, it is a requirement, it can't be waived.
And the only way you get around that is this question of human rights. So if it's required under human rights, and so, but I absolutely agree that generally it's a question of what the law says. And in the U.S., in a number of instances, Congress, not the executive branch, but Congress has carved out narrow exceptions to environmental impact assessment requirements for specific projects. And so I would say that that's those two questions pair very nicely. And then there's one.
Carl, let me just jump in on that one quickly.
Yes.
I think from my side, the biggest need in the world of EIA is making sure that that final EIA data, the raw data itself, the non-commercial component of the raw data, is released into the public domain and becomes part of a global public good, or at least a national public good. Because if you look at the amount of data that some of these collect, it's huge. And in many cases, this data dies in the report itself. It's not released. It's not made public. This is a huge waste of a huge amount of investment in collecting that information. So I think if people want to know where they should be pushing, I would argue in publication and release of that data, the non-commercial parts of that data, in an open data format, into the public space and into a public data commons.
I think that highlights an important aspect of this, which is that sometimes, even if most members of the public might not be able to use that information, there are many other actors within civil society and beyond that could use the information to help inform the public, to guide the public.
Yeah, like the way I see it, that's really important baseline information that needs to be in the public domain. And nowadays, you have so many sources of additional monitoring data that groups can basically use that as a baseline, use satellite data and other kinds of data, and then actually monitor themselves what's going on. They don't have to rely necessarily on government information only. They can do real-time citizen-based monitoring, and I think this is fantastic. I think that the potential to use frontier technologies and big data is amazing, and I really think so. From that perspective, baseline information is really important, and it has to be made public so that citizens can do the monitoring themselves.
There's a comment about one more comment on EIA. China is considering a One Belt, One Road project. Can projects like that have negative environmental security and sustaining peace impacts? Our country accepted that One Belt, One Road project we faced on financial conflict between Myanmar and China, as I think. Indeed, China projects are ever neglect. So these projects often neglect environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment activities. I don't know. I'm trying to think about examples where EIAs have been tied to conflict. I think that more often it's where governments absolutely fail to consider environmental impacts or to address them or to address the social impacts. You often see localized conflicts. Sometimes these conflicts can escalate, as in Bougainville, but you see this a lot around extractive industries. You see some of it around large infrastructure projects. I haven't seen, I'm trying to think if I can think of any that are tied to extended armed conflict. It tends to be much more localized violence and instability. Sometimes these things can go on for years. I mean, Bougainville is now 20-some years that the mine's been closed. And a lot of that's because the environmental impacts and the lack of benefit sharing and the lack of voice, that there was just such a strong reaction to the whole endeavor.
Yeah, I would say on this one, we're having an active conversation, obviously, with different stakeholders in this process. And again, it goes back to EIA and SEA. That's exactly one of our asks, is to ensure that those processes are taken forward systematically across the initiative, and that the monitoring information and the environmental performance information of each of those assessments is released on a regular basis, because we think that kind of transparency is the way to keep on top of these things and to identify where there are problems and to mitigate them, hopefully before they can potentially trigger any kind of social conflict. So absolutely, from our side, it's a fundamental requirement in terms of the process, in terms of releasing data, and in terms of monitoring potential risks as they unfold, and deploying any kind of mediation strategies as necessary.
Moving to South Sudan. Question. In South Sudan, cattle raiding continues to flame conflict and displacement of population, even after signing a peace agreement. How can the approach of environmental security help achieve a lasting peace? I would say that this is a great example of this great follow-on to this question, what does the word post-conflict mean? That even after you have a peace agreement, you can still have violence and flare-ups, and whether that means that you're in new conflict is another question. But I think that this also highlights one of the challenges is that conflict often happens at multiple levels. And I think that the conflicts often, when they're at multiple levels, they may be over different things. So that it might be over territory and oil at one level, it might be over land and grazing at another level, it might be over cattle raiding. So I think that this is this highlights a number of issues. That I think the question is more from a positive standpoint: how can the approach of environmental security help achieve a lasting peace? I would emphasize a few things. One of those is that sometimes there is a solution within the statutory framework and institutions, and sometimes you need to go to more traditional forms of negotiation and conflict resolution. And there are a number of examples, both for cattle raiding and for ag pastoral disputes, of resolution of these disputes, not through more formal statutory processes, but through customary institutions. And I think one of the difficulties in a lot of countries is that there is a tension between the central government, which is trying to impose more uniform statutory approaches, and the customary norms and institutions. And with that expansion of the state, there's often a weakening of those customary institutions. And so one of the things that you see in a lot of cases is the move to legal pluralism, that is embracing both the customary or traditional and the statutory frameworks in the same space, and thinking about how those relate to one another.
Yeah, I think that's right. Obviously that's right. I think the other thing that it's hard to answer this question, because we'd have to understand what are the drivers of the cattle raiding, and is it an underlying historical grievance? Is it a threat to livelihoods? I mean, is it long-term environmental degradation? We'd have to understand in more detail what's driving the raiding.
Yeah.
Why are the livelihoods not secure, and what can we do about securing the livelihoods in a manner that then prevents the raiding? But without knowing the details, it's very hard for me to then just come in with some kind of suggestion. I guess the suggestion would be understand the drivers, understand why livelihoods are vulnerable, what are the creating those vulnerabilities, and then what could be done to reduce them so that the raiding could possibly stop. I think one of the interesting things.
Go ahead, David.
I was going to say, one of the interesting, again, it's a question of what are the technologies as well, not in this particular cattle raiding, but in more efficient access to information for grazing. How can we use technology to help herding communities find fertile pastures more efficiently? How can we direct them to areas that are not agricultural or being used by other land uses? So how can we get more data into the hands of herding communities in a manner that makes their activity more efficient and less potential conflictual?
Yeah, and so I think that there's another aspect here, which is, as David said, it's the understanding why this is happening, what the drivers of the conflict are. Is it economic? Is it shortage? Or is it identity? Sometimes this is, there are cultural beliefs that all cattle are ours. And so whoever has cattle, those are our cattle, and we are supposed to recapture them. it could also be rites of passage. So thinking about what those are and trying to either address them, change them, transform them, or work within those. There was a question about, can we speak about the connections between global security and climate change? And then I'm particularly interested in nuclear armed conflict. And I don't know, I think the last part, I think is, I'm not certain how to tie that to climate change, but there's been a lot of discussion about, is climate change a security issue? If it is, then what does that mean? And David, I'm curious from your perspective how you would answer this.
Well, ultimately, I think Mark covers this in one of the videos. I mean, ultimately, from my side, it's really about the impact on natural resource availability and distribution, and the knock-on effects in terms of livelihoods, water security, food security, and how that then interacts with other stresses and pressures to, basically create social conflict and violence. So from my side, we have to be doing a much better job at understanding how climate change is affecting resource quality, resource frequency, resource distribution. What are the reliant livelihoods? What is the connection between food security, water security, etc. And then how are those creating social conflict and potentially escalating? And then what can be done about it? How do you intervene to secure livelihoods and improve resilience to climate change and security risks? We're learning right now how to do that, frankly. We're learning how to identify where the hotspots are. We're learning to understand what resilience to those risks mean. And we're learning to understand, how do you have an intervention that deals with governance issues, livelihood issues, and natural resource issues in some kind of blended package. And typically, it's always a combination of those different kinds of interventions. But we're learning how to do it right now. We've got a big program with the European Union in Nepal and in Sudan, where we're looking at mapping climate change and security risks nationally, where we see hotspots. We're dipping down into those communities, and we're trying to work with the communities to basically build resilience to different climatic shocks and stresses that could cause insecurity and conflict. But it's a work ongoing. Certainly, we're looking to collect lessons and really understand how to do this and how to really monitor. From my side, it's about monitoring the impact and showing the results that we're having. And so that's also a huge area of work. Now, the relevance here is that at the New York level, there is now something called the Climate Security Mechanism, which was created just last year. And it's a partnership between UNDP, UNEP, and the Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, where we're trying to more systematically assess climate change and security risks and feed that information into the UN system, into the Security Council, in a manner that it can inform prevention strategies going forward. So this is a new mechanism, and we are working to basically, how do we send this kind of detailed analysis into it? What are the responses, and how do we actually change things on the ground in terms of reducing vulnerability and improving resilience?
I'm really glad you mentioned the mechanism. I think you're absolutely right to have people focus on this when they get to Mark's lectures next week. I want to highlight a couple of things just for the moment on this, though. One is, I think historically, a lot of thinking was focused on how climate change is going to create shortages that will lead to conflicts. One of the things that we're seeing, I think, recently is that it's not just about the conflicts where the droughts, for example, might be. It's also what happens afterward, that people flee, whether they're fleeing because their crops have failed and they're trying to find a better life, or they're fleeing the violence that has flared up. And this migration has become a key dynamic that we're really starting to understand, trying to understand when it happens and what the effects are. And I think that's where a lot of the global security, it's not just a question of fighting in this place, but that it then spreads and the burdens can be so large that it destabilizes other countries. And it's not just the neighboring countries, as we saw with the recent migration crisis from Syria and to a lesser extent other countries in the Middle East to Europe, that this can have much longer geographic reach than people have been talking about a few years ago.
But also what you just said, Carl, the political implications of that pulse into Europe were huge, and they have very real effects in terms of right to left or left to right political shifts. And so there are big implications that a lot of people are very, concerned about on the global political side. So it's a great other dimension to be thinking about in terms of this particular topic.
David, there's a request to repeat the name of the climate security mechanism.
You just did.
Climate security mechanism.
Yeah, I think there's in one incarnation it was called the climate security mini mechanism because it's a very small team and they wanted to manage expectations, but I think the mini has been dropped. So I think it's now just the climate security mechanism, but it's based in New York. On the UNEP side, we're represented in that mechanism by a colleague named Matti Lettunen. And if you do a UNEP search for him, I'm sure you'll find him, but you can also contact me and I'd be happy to connect you to him.
The other thing that I wanted to just highlight on this on climate change and global security, and this will come out, I think, in force in next week's lectures, is the importance of governance, that climate change does not necessarily lead to conflict or insecurity. It is a stress. How governments respond determines whether it's merely a stress that societies and countries endure, or if it's something that escalates. And so I think that it's very important to be clear that we're not saying climate change causes conflict, because there are plenty of counterexamples that show how countries can weather these stresses. And it's really in the governance failures that we see conflict.
Yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind is how does the changing distribution of natural resources or increasing resource scarcity affect men and women differently? And if you're building resilience, what do you have to do in each case to improve it? Because I'm convinced that from the evidence I've seen, it's actually very different kinds of interventions that need to be undertaken. So when we're doing the analyses, we do have to make that distinction and really understand, how men and women rely on natural resources differently. How are they involved in governance mechanisms? How are they economically empowered by them? And what are the entry points for improving resilience to climate change and security risk?
We are now coming to the close. There are a lot of other questions that have been asked that we haven't had a chance to get to. David, I don't know if there are any that you want to grab before we close in the next 2 minutes.
I shall look through the list and see if any pique my interest. Do you have one that you want to jump on, Carl?
A lot of these are let me see. So there's a question here about success stories between balance of hydroelectricity and water for irrigation of crops and food security. I think I'd like to hold that for Erica Weinthal, who really is best able to address this. I think there's a question that was rather interesting about what are the traditional best practices to resolve conflicts in areas where both sides are not willing to stop fighting for fear of losing to the opposing side. And this gets at one question of how do you build the will to stop, and the other is kind of this identity. You don't want to lose to the other side or be perceived, and even where entering into a settlement is perceived as not a win and therefore a loss. And so I think that that's a very interesting question. I don't know if you have any insights into that.
I can jump on your insights, Carl, if you want to start.
So I think part of it is really, getting at building that will to stop. And I remember a story from a friend who went into, he came back from northern Kenya, and there were a couple of clans that went to a paramount chief saying, we want you to resolve this dispute over cattle, as it was. And the paramount chief said, well, have you fought yet? No, we're asking you to resolve it. And the paramount chief said, well, go fight. When you're tired, come back to me. You're not ready for my judgment. I don't like that answer, but I think that there's a need to have a will to prevent conflict, to end conflict. And that may be in addressing, if people are benefiting from conflict resources, trying to stem the flow of those resources so that they see more value in peace.
Yep.
But looking at the conflict dynamics to think about how do you build that will to end?
Yeah, and how do you detect when the parties are ripe to sit down at the table and to enter into negotiations, mediation? Listen, before we end, I wanted to take a bit of a turn here, just briefly, just to mention to everybody the case of Nilofar Bayani, our colleague who used to work in UN Environment, who is now in prison in Iran under the death penalty, or under the threat of the death penalty. She was imprisoned while doing some very important scientific research and working on the conservation of endangered species. If you follow her story, please do whatever you can to get the word out and to make some political noise about the violation of human rights and about the fact that this needs to be resolved and that she needs to be released from this situation. It's untenable. And if you have a way of influencing and getting your member state representative to make a statement, some kind of political statement around this, please do so. This needs to be on the global agenda, and we need to do whatever we can to help get her out. Thank you.
David, maybe you could post a link to her case or information for those who are interested to do that in the discussion group.
Sure, I can do that right now. Yep.
Okay.
In the group chat, you mean?
For those who are interested in what you just said, where they can find more information.
Sure.
So thank you all. This has been very productive discussion. I really appreciate the questions. And for those who have not been able to get their questions answered here, please post them on the discussion forums, and we'll see if we can respond to them. And with that, see you all next week. Take care.